We are back for the moment. We're going to start live in about 8 minutes, so you'll just see the title screen for Jamie's presentation for a little while here, but we will be back in about 8 minutes going live for the next set of sessions. Hey, Mark Miller here, getting ready for the next session for the afternoon here. What we're looking at to start off with is we're going to start off with Jamie Whitehouse. And that way we can talk with Jamie Whitehouse, who is the product owner of Lifecycle. That's pretty exciting because Jamie and his team have been working on things for the last year that he can tell us about. The next thing that we're going to be doing after that is we'll be talking with DJ Schleen. We've become very good friends with DJ personally and professionally here at the office because he's such a nice guy to know. He's been on the speaking circuit for the last year now, telling the Aetna story. So if you want to know what it's like at a very large enterprise to be able to manage and roll out DevSecOps initiatives with a Nexus at the heart of it, DJ's got the story for that. Following DJ is Sarah Elkins, the CI/CD pipeline at the NIH, the National Cancer Institute. That's kind of close to my heart here. The idea that the people that are actually making a difference in the healthcare industry will be able to use our product and our platform to help with that. I mean, it gives real validation for the work that we're doing. I'm really happy to hear that story. And then we're going to talk with Jim Bird, again, one of the guys that we've known for years coming up. And Jim's now working with BIDSTrading, and he's going to talk about quick wins for securing a continuous delivery. We got a good afternoon ahead of us there, so get yourself logged in and set up. Jamie, are you with us? I want to make sure that your mic is working as we're checking you in here. I see Jamie's cursor moving. Jamie, it looks like you are muted. Are you doing okay with that?
There we go. How's that?
All right. Just making sure that that we can hear you. Go ahead and talk a little bit, Jamie, just so that we can see things are working.
Sure thing. Testing. This is Jamie Whitehouse. I'm the now product owner of Nexus Lifecycle and Firewall.
So, as I said in the introduction here, Jamie is the head of the Lifecycle team. He's going to talk about things that you probably don't know about Lifecycle, the things that he and the team have been working on for the last 12 months, and I'll let you into the back door here. So, Jamie, I'm going to turn it over to you from here, and let's hear what you got.
All right. So first, a little introduction. As I mentioned, I'm the product owner of Nexus Lifecycle and Firewall. I've been here since the beginning of the product. Around 2011 is when we conceived of it. Then I was a developer, a tech lead, and more recently, I'm now the product owner. So I'm passionate about this product, passionate about making sure people know about what we have to offer as well. So this session, I thought I'd pick 5 features to show you in about 5 minutes. Some of these you may know, some of them you may not. Some of them you may find a new way to use to get some value out of. So here's the list. I'm going to show you about our LDAP servers, SuccessMetrix, Webhooks, our vulnerability information, and our new condensed data format. These are all reasons why keeping up to date with our releases is good. At least I would prefer you're up to date. You know, don't lag too much more than 3 months behind, but we know some people, their upgrade cycles are a lot longer. So here's some incentives. Multiple LDAP servers. You might be running a single LDAP server and wonder, why do I care? We've seen with many customers, their LDAP servers perform differently depending on the users they're looking for, the groups that they belong to. So how you want to associate your permissions inside of IQ server can dramatically affect how those users and permissions are retrieved from an LDAP server, especially with different indexes and things. We introduced multiple LDAP servers, and one of the things that you can do with it is actually create a configuration for the same LDAP server. The configuration is unique per your LDAP server configuration, even if it's connecting to the exact same server. So in this way, you can create a more performant configuration and put it near the top of your list. And the poorer performing configurations, which are maybe more unique or esoteric configurations to catch that one person who doesn't fit in the other groups can be near the bottom. So this is a way that you can improve the performance of IQ server with its LDAP lookups and potentially reduce the load on your LDAP server. It's there. It's been there for a while. At the end, I didn't want to shock everybody. So at the end, I'll show you which versions these were available in. Another one is SuccessMetrix. This one we rolled out last year over several releases, providing some value across each one of them. This lets you visualize the impact and adoption at a really high level. So on the screen here, I've got one metric. I'm going to flip to the actual application and show you a few others. You can configure it for an org. You can configure it for a number of apps, a specific app. The other thing that you can also configure it for is monthly aggregates, which is really useful if you're trying to put together a presentation, a quarterly presentation. Hey, how great are we doing? How's our adoption? And look at the fact that our vulnerabilities are going down or our license compliance is going up. And alternatively, you can also create a report that's live. So it shows you to the minute, basically. When an evaluation is done, the data is updated and it'll show up in the results. An important thing to notice with this as well, though, is they're the reports are per user. So you can't share the reports. This is yours. It's based on your permissions of which applications or which organizations you can see. I'm gonna try switching my screen here. So here's a demo. This is the same screenshot I put in the slide. So one of the things you can see is we kind of say, what's your average number of violations? That's often a thing we get. What's my average? How am I doing over time? And we break it down between critical and everything else. So you can kind of see the proportion representation here. We also break it down by the policy type, security versus license, etc. One of the most interesting reports I think that we have here, though, is the mean time to resolution by month. So in this chart, you can see how long it took to resolve something and when it was resolved. So of the items resolved in September, they took less than 25. In fact, it looks like it's probably closer to 15 days to resolve for the criticals. And then this was for all. So we separate them because typically when you're prioritizing, you want to look at your critical ones first. Those are the ones that you tell your developers and your security researchers and your teams, pay off the criticals first. So you can see here, we probably had one, and this was probably something that was around for a very long time, and we finally fixed it in September. So it took a long time to resolve. But if you look at our criticals, we're really good at addressing them, right? Usually between, I'm guessing here with the chart, 10 days, probably 10 to 15 days. And again, you hear me say I'm guessing at the chart. This is that high level view. It's not the precise, it's not I want to drill in. It's take a screenshot of this, put in your slide deck, show your boss, show your manager, show your executives and say, look, we're using IQ very effectively here. Our time to resolve the criticals is less than a month, whereas before that was 60 days, 80 days, whatever. There's a couple other views in here. I'm not going to go into detail on every single one of them. This one here is application by violations by policy type. So how many applications are in that area? How many are impacted? So it gives you kind of an idea of the surface area or the bomb blast, so to speak. And then this last section here is again also really interesting, is of your components, how are they used? So again, this is filtered down to the applications you have visibility to and the applications that you configured for this SuccessMetrix report. In this case, you can see that we're using 20 applications. On average, there's 117 components per app. And here's the ones that are used most across the apps. And so again, this kind of shows you that bomb blast radius or potentially efficiencies, right? I'm using a lot of components shared across my applications, which is fantastic because if there's bugs or issues, one team can investigate, and I get that learning across all teams instead of everybody being unique and having a lot of duplicated effort. And then also in the component section, we highlight the components raising the most policy violations. In the Maven world, the gav is really long, so you got to roll over the tooltip. You can see this is the driver. This one's for tars. This one's for zips. So TrueZip has got a violation that probably impacts all of its code base. So that's why it's cranking up the scores here. That's SuccessMetrix. You're probably not going to use it on a day-to-day basis, but it's really valuable to highlight to your stakeholders how things are going. Also, you could use it to review with your team. If you're reviewing with your team on a monthly basis, you can pull this up and you can be like, last month we were doing okay. This month we're not. What happened? Since you can narrow this down to a per application. Go back to the presentation. So this other one is webhooks. We introduced webhooks. There's a variety of them. The one I'm showing here is the application evaluation event. This is really useful for external integrations instead of having to hit up our REST API, constantly pinging it. Is it here? Do you have anything new? Trying to do a diff. All the reasons why you would use a webhook is why you would use this. In this case, we've seen Bree, one of our content developers and educators. She worked with Justin to highlight how to do an integration with webhooks, and I'll have a link to that later on. But the result is you can see that we've done a policy evaluation and it shows up in my Slack channel and it tells me I've got 11 critical violations. So very similar to any of your CI servers, the build's failed or it's become unstable, you get a message in the channel. Your production systems were experiencing higher traffic load, you get a message in your channel. A support ticket comes in that the support team wants to get a hold of you. They mark it as expedite, it shows up in your channel. Right? So you're in your channel and you get the notification. So this is really useful for those kinds of notifications around evaluations. Like I said, we do have other webhooks also available. They're more for events about changes, things like the policy configuration has changed. Those ones are good if you're trying to keep track of when policy has changed, if you have a policy administrator who needs to review them. You can check out our help content for the various webhooks and what their payloads look like. I think I'm on to number 4 now. This is our vulnerability information. It's not terribly new. It's been around for a long time, but often it is the first thing that we're asked, right? Is users, new customers, existing customers, people who've been with us for a long time, but their users are new, or it's a new security researcher or a new developer. And it's like, what can you tell me about this vulnerability? Why would I look at your information instead of just going to the CVS website, or sorry, the CVE website, or going off to Apache's security bulletin? So I wanted to highlight this. This is what it looks like. We call it the enhanced vulnerability information. It's the vulnerability information that our researchers here do. They curate it, and it's not just curate, cut and paste, it's deep dive investigation. And I wanted to kind of show some of that in context here. On our website, our help site, we have a whole section that talks about what our vulnerability data is, why it's significant, how it's different than what you can get publicly, what our team does. For this example, I reached to something that was really similar, really recent. We wrote up a blog post. It's about Marked, which has a regex DOS vulnerability in it. And the reason why this is significant is there was some contention between other researchers in the public and the project itself. The project really wanted to fix the problem, but they wanted to understand the problem. And there was a lot of discussion and contention around it. So I'll get to that part in a minute, but I wanted to highlight the effect. the vulnerability is pretty severe. So marked as a Node.js package. You run it on your server side if you want. You can use it in the browser. On the server side, as we see in the blog post, it's particularly problematic because Node.js is single-threaded. You can basically perform a denial of service attack against a server. So with a little under 10K of data, you can block the event loop for 5 minutes. There's a bunch of caveats that's highlighted in this article around the data limit that often HTTP headers and payloads provide. And so we did this is again that real world test. This is up to that limit. So you're blocking your app for up to 5 minutes. If you haven't read the post, I encourage you to read it. I'm use it as a segue here since it's recent. And to highlight that it's recent, it actually affects 0319. So this isn't just a fictitious example where we grabbed something from a long time ago and said, hey, let's make a fuss over this kind of thing. It's recent, it's prominent. I did an evaluation with Lifecycle here. So here's the results. It actually has 3 vulnerabilities, and I want to take you through that. This is the specific one that's mentioned in the blog post. And you can see we're still affected, 040. This winds up being our own, so you can see that it has its own Sonatype identifier. This one here, 2018-0076. It all started way back when, and with this CVE though. This is something that came through the National Vulnerability Database, NVD. You can see it came through, and through the conversation that the project team had with the original researchers, which weren't Sonatype, they came to the conclusion that the vulnerability they reported against the NVD was inaccurate. So they updated the description. They said, don't use this. We rescind our vulnerability. We were incorrect. And you can go read about it all on the GitHub pull request or issue number as well. But it's basically highlighting there's a RDoS attack. Go find a non-vulnerable version. So later on, it came up again. Here's some of the things that our security researchers do. So we have a deviation, right? We found out about it. We looked at it. They said it was actually fixed or introduced in a certain version, and we've done our diligence to highlight the specific versions it affects. It may be a range, it may be a discontinuous range, but we went and checked those versions and found out which versions are specific. That way you can have automated enforcement on it. And then we also note this in here because you may be looking at the public information and saying, well, why is it different? Why Sonatype do you think it's so different? And we explain that right here. And then this is the one that's mentioned in the blog post. So you can see we explain it. It can be exploit. It can make your process unresponsive, blocking subsequent requests, and basically filling up your queue on your server side. And that's our enhanced vulnerability information, the curated information that we do the deep dive research on. And number 5 is our condensed data format. This came out earlier this year. Most of our customers have a smallish database where we store all of our information, the violation information and configuration and stuff. Smallish being like less than 50 megabytes, usually less than a gigabyte. We do have a set of customers though where that's not the norm. They're in the gigabytes or tens of gigabytes. And that starts to affect performance, it starts to affect provisioning, it starts to affect backups. And given the fact that we know all customers are going to increase their adoption as new applications come on board, new versions, as you're keeping track of what's out in production, as new violations come up, given the fact that violations happen over time as your components age, we knew everybody's data was going to grow over time. So we sat down late last year I think it probably started at the tail end of the summer, and started really looking at the problem, how to solve it, what we could solve. Were there interesting and novel ways? And the development team took a few different takes at it, looked at it from different perspectives to see what we could save and what impact that actually had to performance, right? We don't want to save space if all of a sudden performance drops, right? Your request duration takes longer, the time to do evaluations take longer and all that. We don't want that. So we came upon a solution in our own testing against various data set sizes of different models. We saw conservatively a 50% reduction, in some cases a 75% reduction in disk space. In what we've seen in the real world, we have a customer who went from over 100 gigabytes down to, I think they're at less than 15 gigabytes now. I think they might be 12 or something like that. So a massive reduction in size. This also comes with a bit of a challenge because we've rearranged the way we store the data, so we have to convert the data. And given your environment, we don't know how long that's going to take. So this is actually one of the rare disrupting changes that we have in our releases. And you have to explicitly acknowledge that you want to go ahead with the release when you bring the server up. You have to explicitly acknowledge that you want to go ahead with the release because it could take an unknown duration, and that might turn into an outage window. A normal release is you upgrade in place and it's just a restart of the server and you're done. But in this case, the outage might be 30 minutes, it might be 10 seconds, it might be 5 hours. It really depends on your disks. It depends on the I/O with those disks. It depends on the data set itself. So we actually have a whole page that tries to walk you through this very carefully. And again, I'll share some links later, but it talks about how to upgrade, why you should upgrade, what you want to look at. And so you can read the bullet points here, right? Make sure you have enough disk space. You want to do a database compaction before. Afterwards, you also want to do a database compaction. That doesn't have to be immediate. You could schedule it in a different window. But because each customer is different, we want to provide enough information for them to make the right decisions in their environment, rather than us making one size fit all and having a detrimental impact for some customers and no impact for others. So that was 5 in, looking at my clock, less than 5 minutes, I think. So the big reveal, when did these come out? Most of them were last year, as you can see. Some were this year, and one was a long time ago. So multiple LDAP servers is actually almost 2 years old now. It came out in January of 2017. SuccessMetrix came out. The last feature we added for SuccessMetrix was in September of last year. Like I said, throughout all of last year, we were delivering features around SuccessMetrix. It wasn't a dark launch. It was something you could use. It started off with the root org, and then we kept adding more and more functionality so different people could use it instead of waiting until the end of September. Webhooks were out again in the same release that multiple LDAP servers was in January of last year. So 2 years. You've got 2 years that you could have been using it. The vulnerability information's been around since 2015. Again, I highlighted it because many people ask, what's the difference between you and public information? What can you help me with? Why would I use your information? So I wanted to highlight that because it's almost every single user winds up looking at it or interacting with it or asking us those questions. Whereas something like LDAP servers, it's your administrator. They notice it, they set it up, and it's done. And again, the condensed data format, that's fairly new. It's on 146 is the release you should use. 145, we noticed a couple of performance enhancements that we could do in addition. So we made those and rolled them into 146. So these are all good reasons why if you stay recent, you get the good stuff. You watch the release notes to kind of see what's new. We have the new community. And so in the community, I'm sure people will be talking about the things that are new and how they're using them there as well. Thank you for attending.
All right. Jamie, a couple things came up as I was listening to you. Some very interesting stuff. As you're looking at the features that have been developed in the last year, what do you think is the most unused feature that has the most value?
Hmm. So I would say SuccessMetrix. It's probably one of the biggest things, and the reason why it has the most value is the pictures are really nice out of the box. You can cut and paste. You don't have to create your own charts, but it takes the work. It takes the work off of your plate to create the information and distill it in a way that says, here's what we're doing with our server, with IQ server, with Lifecycle, and in a way that you can then configure on a per organization basis or a per application basis or an aggregate, and be able to take that to various audiences. Like I said, you could take it to your teams. You go to a team once a week or every bug triage or something like that, and you're looking at that. You can take it up to your executives and say, look, our adoption is on track or it's not. Like maybe your adoption's not on track. You expected to have 50 applications by now and you don't. What are we going to do about that? So I think it's probably the one that most people don't know about, because it's easy to dismiss it because it doesn't help your day to day. But I think it definitely helps you in the long run.
Excellent. The other one that kind of caught my eye here was the webhooks into Slack. That's a very cool implementation. Can you do that into Slack or Jira or HipChat?
Yep. So you can use webhooks to integrate into anything. You, Brianne or Bree, sorry, and Justin, they have an excellent write-up of how to do it, and you could follow that template for anything that could take webhooks into Slack, into HipChat. You want it to send some notice and turn the light green versus red. You can do all that with the webhook.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for all the work you're doing. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
All right. As we finish up with Jamie here, we'll be moving into DJ Schleen with Aetna. DJ is one of the people that we love hanging out with wherever we go, to the point that we're actually going to be taking him with us on a tour that's coming up, and I'm sure that DJ will be telling us about that. DJ, I'm looking at you. Are you unmuted? Can I hear you now?
Hey, Mark, what's going on?
Hey, there you are. Good to see you. I think we're here for competing beards. I think mine is outgrowing yours, though.
Oh gosh, yeah, I got to do the scruffy, just get rid of the goatee.
Very happy to have you with us. I love hearing you expanding on what's been happening over the last year with Aetna, because your story is indicative of what's possible. And that's the thing that I like hearing you talk about. I remember when you and me and John Willis first met a year ago, and you had rolled out the story of, security across the entire enterprise, and John was just floored. And so now we're stepping up. It's a year later. Your story has continued to improve. So very much looking forward to having you talk to you about it. And go ahead and share your slides and we'll get started.
Absolutely. And it's great to be here. Okay.
There you go. You're ready to go. Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, hey, everyone. Thanks for attending. And today I'm taking this story a little bit further. Rather than just focusing on the pipeline, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into how to start automating software development, especially around the Nexus platform. And a lot of this is based on experience, not only where I'm working right now, but in the past historically in jobs before I've actually came to Aetna. So starting off, the story really begins with this open source software, and I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant right now. There's many different repositories out there, Docker, Ruby gems. These are the things that Nexus platform supports and really allows us to work with as development operations and as security organizations, a little bit better than we've ever had. Hackers know more about their code bases than all of us do. All this open source code that's out there in these repositories, and even Docker layers, everything can be deconstructed and utilized against organizations that use these components. Underlying base images are really riddled with errors and vulnerabilities when it comes to Docker. For example, there's one large company that produces software, not Sonatype, but we've seen this happen in the last couple of weeks where we acquired an image from this organization, and we ran it through our scanning tools, and we ran it through Sonatype Lifecycle to find out the open source vulnerabilities. And we also ran it through some container vulnerability analysis tools. And we found out that they had 6 critical vulnerabilities, and they were distributing this software knowingly to their customers with these vulnerabilities included. For a large organization, that really introduces unnecessary risk, right? We definitely don't want to have that in our environments. We wouldn't produce this kind of software for our customers. So we want to make sure that anything that we're bringing into our environments don't introduce some vulnerabilities. So I always think that open source software is really just lunch for unicorns. You feed garbage in and you get garbage out, and then the security organization starts dealing with these incidents. And thanks to Pete Cheslock for this image, and of course hijinks ensue for the original graphic. So where do we begin? And that's the biggest question that organizations have. It's harder to start a race than it is to finish it, right? And when you find a good place to start, it's probably the most difficult thing, right? You can't really pinpoint it. Most folks just start with a build server and CI, and having code checked in by their developers, and they run a continuous or build server, and they call that continuous integration, and that's not really the way that it goes. Continuous integration is constantly merging code into master branches, and doing feature branches, and really having a thought out methodology for developing software, integrating into your master branch, and then throwing that down some kind of pipeline tool. So we'll look a little bit about branching and merging. And one of the favorite branching and merging strategies I like to use is Git flow. So we have this master branch, and that's your golden branch. Anything that you want to do, you want to protect that branch, make sure no vulnerabilities get into it. And if they do, you want to remediate them pretty much instantly. The way I have this documented, everything above this is development, and everything below this is things that go to production as releases. And we have continuous delivery and continuous deployment, 2 different things. But when we're deploying to our production environment, what we're doing is we're really tagging a release number. And then if we see something that happens in production, like a vulnerability or some kind of bug, we can either hot fix it. But in the age of containers, we just fix it and redeploy it. So we get used to that velocity. When you look at a development branch and a master branch, those kind of branches isolate each other, and you isolate the development team from that golden branch. And then features basically are just developers branching off of that dev branch in their own isolated environment where they can perform, they can code, they can have their own isolated environment where they can develop. And what these do is they give us a lot of automation opportunities. So if you know your branching and merging strategy, you already are ahead of the pack, where you can go in and say, well, every time we do a pull request, for example, that's an automation opportunity. Basically, what ends up happening, if you do a Git flow methodology, or really any kind of branching and merging strategy, if you do a pull request and try to get your development branch into master, there's a couple of things you can do there. You can run a lot of automated tools. You can do static code analysis. You can run a Nexus Lifecycle open source scan. You can run pretty much any kind of tool as long as you have a good pipeline defined. And we're going to get into the pipeline a little bit later. But you can also take that opportunity to have humans look at this code base and do code reviews. So it's a great opportunity for an education, educating people in coding standards and linting and that kind of thing. So, merging is a great place to start introducing automation. The other place that you want to do it is you want to do it at a daily basis on the master and your release branches. So any kind of security vulnerability or security scan that's been done is only as good as the moment it was created or kicked off and the results came back. So things that are in the master branch, especially for software that hasn't been maintained for a long period of time, they could have vulnerabilities that are introduced at a later date. Because vulnerabilities happen every day. It seems like every day we have another crazy vulnerability that comes out, or crazy attack vector that's been discovered, or weakness in software. So we want to scan our master branches regularly and make sure that we get our results back. And then the other place we can look at automation is at the feature level where people are developing their software. So these are the IDE plugins that we're looking at. And this is getting that instant feedback to developers. So with these three types of automation opportunities, you're really covering a lot of the bases of performing security scanning or any kind of evaluation in your branching and merging strategies. So pipelines. And this is a slide that I have evolved over the past year and a half. And it's an interesting one. It really takes the idea of a feature from a product owner all the way to production environment and even beyond, because one of the things that traditionally happens is in non-DevOps environments is when an application goes out to production, it's usually forgotten. Either budgets have dried up, the project is over, and there's no cost center to support it. And that causes a lot of problems, because if there's a vulnerability, the first thing that happens is folks say, well, I don't have any budget for it. So, when you're thinking about product from a business perspective, you always want to bake in some kind of support into your production operations. And if you're running a continuous product and you're constantly developing it long term and there is no end date to this product development, you definitely want to take into consideration your production costs and what's how much that's operating and what kind of vulnerabilities that are happening in that environment. So really quickly, what we're going to focus on here is this is all application lifecycle management, and this duration could take minutes to hours. Sometimes it takes weeks. But what we want to do with DevSecOps or DevOps is really improve the flow and the velocity that we push things into production. And our automated steps, which is that green line across the top of this diagram, what that does is it separates concerns. So from a compliance perspective, you have different systems dealing with different pieces or stages of the pipeline. And then you can have handoffs between these stages where you can attest that the previous stage has actually been executed. So this gives that non-repudiation as the product goes through the pipeline. As well, all of these security tools that are in blue here, you want to consolidate those vulnerabilities. One of the problem areas that has been identified here for the last couple of months is we're running these scanning tools and we're getting all this vulnerability information from all the tools we're using, and there's a lot of overlap. And so there's two things that happen. Either you get a vulnerability that's in multiple locations, and then you have 15 different tickets or even 100 different tickets created if you automate work item creation. And that gets really complicated, especially to manage that from a business perspective. So what we're looking at is an opportunity to consolidate these vulnerabilities into one specific work item that lists the occurrences. And that helps just contain the noise and really improves the flow of the process and the triage and the prioritization of a backlog. So from the vulnerability consolidation, one of the things we do is toss everything to our data analysis and security modeling group, and they perform security models to try to figure out where something's going to happen next, maybe correlating a cyber event or a development event to a physical event that happens. So a lot of information comes out of that. And a lot of KPIs get distributed where we can monitor things like security drag, defect escape rate to production, these kind of really important DevSecOps and DevOps KPIs. And all this information as well goes back to the product owner. So they can make decisions, they can react to these vulnerabilities, they can prioritize based on severity and impact and likelihood, and put those things back into the pipeline and get the developers to work on specific tasks. And of course, all this information, if there are vulnerabilities that are critical, they go to our SOC and our Security Operations Center. And from there, we can actually manage the remediation of these issues. So imagine having an open source component that is pervasive across our enterprise. The SOC is going to manage this issue and manage that remediation and keep the enterprise informed of the patching or the exposure that we have to that vulnerability. So the Nexus platform sweet spot, I believe, is really between coding the infrastructure and a staging environment, and even into production as well. But from this diagram here, third-party components come in at the development level, and we can use the opportunity there to block specific third-party libraries or open source software that has a CVSS score that's 10 and even like 7, 3. The idea here is we want to point where our applications have 0 open source software vulnerabilities. And there's some different concerns around that, which we'll get into a little bit later, but that's sort of a scary concept for developers where they're look at these components to help boot, give a bit of a head start to their development. And without those components, there's different options to use other components or develop, but that's a bit of a fear spot, and we'll dig into that a little bit later. Once we commit that code to our source control system, we can run different tools, and one of those is, again, scanning for open source components. And that's a backup more than anything else, because as developers are bringing these components into their environment and building their software, they might not check in on a regular basis. And that's a problem that I see a lot of places. You want to get into the habit of checking in multiple times a day. And that's mainly for merging and integrating with the master branch and just making sure your features don't get so stale that, the pipeline is completed or gone on and more features have been developed and checked in. And now you have a lot of merging issues and that kind of thing. And then when you check in, build that, let's say it's a container, and then we package that as an image, or build the image and then package it. What we want to do there is cryptographically sign the manifest, make sure that we have a bill of materials associated with that image, and then we throw it into our repository. And we use Nexus repository, OSS repository for that. And the nice thing about that repository is it's not just a place to store these images or these components that we develop internally, but it operates as a proxy to Docker Hub and or to any kind of repository, PyPy, Yum, Maven. And what that allows us to do from a security organization is, as these components come into our environment, we know that they're there. So we have this ability to have this visibility that we've never had before. And then once that image is in that repository, and even before it goes into the repository, we can use the Nexus IQ API, plugins for Jenkins. Really, it's very flexible. And we toss our image towards that just to make sure, again, that as we've compiled that together, that any vulnerabilities that have come in from an apt-get or from a wget or something into that image build doesn't have any additional vulnerabilities. So let's dig into when to scan for open source vulnerabilities. So again, I mentioned pull requests, and that's very important. what that does, you can gate things. So gating basically would say, we're doing this merge request, pull request. If there's any vulnerabilities over what we have agreed on, or if it's a brownfield development versus a greenfield, we just deny that pull request. Again, nightly or regularly, you want to do that scan as well. And that's scanning the actual repository, your source code repositories, running a pipeline that runs that, build through Lifecycle or some other tool just to figure out, do you have any new vulnerabilities that you didn't detect because the product is, or the microservice has been in that registry or that repository for a long period of time. And really, it depends on what kind of tool you're using. I found that IQ and Lifecycle specifically are very fast at looking through these code bases and identifying these components, so these jar files or these Ruby gems or whatever you have, and finding out if there's any vulnerabilities about it. Some other tools take forever and could have a long period of time that they're executing. For example, I've seen some tools take up to 24 to 48 hours. That's because it's a really large code base and not necessarily open source software management, but those are static code analysis tools. And for those kind of things, you're going to want to run them regularly. So maybe once or twice a week, and have some allocated capacity to run these things. That's one of the problems that we're facing right now is as we start bringing teams onto our security tools and our DevSecOps pipelines and all of our architecture that we have available and our services we have available from a security perspective, we end up seeing that our capacity is really suffering. And that's a good thing to have, right? That means we're getting people interested in security tools and integrating these into our pipelines. And when that happens, we're building that culture of security and that culture of trust between our organizations, and we're improving the code quality of our applications. And then we also want to have these plugins and these tools integrated into our IDEs. And what that's doing is a couple of different things. First, it's helping gate the components that are coming into the environment. It's letting developers know that there are vulnerabilities potentially in that component that's coming in. And it lets the developer understand what these vulnerabilities do. If there's a new version of that component, it's one of my favorite features of Lifecycle is that, as you're looking at these things in the IDE or in the web interface, you're seeing when that vulnerability happened and if there's any new versions that potentially are clean. And that's gives the developers a lot of power, especially if they're developing a new piece of functionality. They can say, well, I'm going to utilize this new component and reduce those vulnerabilities that are coming into that code base. So some important concepts, and this will finish off the conversation. First off, automation doesn't equal DevSecOps. It sure doesn't equal DevOps, and it very much doesn't equal CI/CD. Automation without understanding and without handoffs, the cultural adoption, the buy-in from the business, and the decision making that happens between stages is not really CI/CD. It's a piece of it. So definitely getting started with automation is the first step. That's what Shannon Leitz will call crawling. And you want to get to, you have to start somewhere. So start automating, but understand that there's more to DevSecOps and DevOps than just tools and process. It's the culture around it as well. And the adoption of that in large enterprises especially is quite challenging, and it requires a lot of different buy-in from executives and business to really change the way that they've siloed their development and operations and security teams in the past. Getting a pipeline, there's a bunch of different pipeline tools available out there, such as Jenkins and GitLab. I prefer GoCD. I think it's very flexible. It's probably one of the coolest and strongest tools out there. a little bit of weirdness with it, but definitely love using it. And it's sort of my, excuse the pun, it's my go-to platform for pipeline. And then, of course, you got Bitbucket. Each of them has a different maturity level. These pipeline tools they're getting out of their infancy stages. I think, from an age perspective, if you compare it to your children, they're a tweenager. They're getting there. And I think over time they're going to mature a bit more. But the number one thing you want to do is really ensure that these pipeline tools at least support the idea of scripting and custom scripting. And most of them do. And they have scripting add-ins where you can customize scripts. And then parallel processing and parallel tasks, in a build stage is also very important. And a lot of tools haven't got to that maturity level just yet. But when you can parallelize, multiple tasks in a build stage, you can actually save time. So for example, GoCD will allow you to do this. And you could have open source software scanning running while you have static code analysis, while you have some other thing running. Imagine a code base that has a client and a server you can build them at the same time on different parallel tracks. And if one fails, maybe they have a shared library, then the other fails too, and the whole stage gets failed. And then you can do some different operations, notify Slack channels. This is where that integration comes in, where you're not just shipping an email off to somebody that they don't read. Anybody who's sent an email to me knows that usually it falls to the bottom of the barrel. But when it comes to a Slack message or a chat room or instant message, I'm always there to respond to those. So pipeline tools, definitely these two features are something you want to look for. And then flow. This is very important, especially from a security tool perspective. And I had mentioned that, a lot of these tools introduce a lot of unnecessary drag, and we want to avoid security drag. And in fact, one of the KPIs that I look at is from the start of a scan, whether it's open source or static code analysis, I want an automated KPI that comes out of that where I know the start time, the end time, and I know the duration. And based on those KPIs and how those relate to specific pipelines and product builds and product deployments, I can identify very quickly where the bottlenecks are and where I'm getting some friction in the process. And developers traditionally are very impatient. I'm a former developer. Well, I guess in DevSecOps, we're all developers. And as a hacker, we're probably one of the OGs of DevSecOps. But when we look at these tools, if you're waiting more than 5 minutes or even more than 2 minutes, you're missing the boat, right? People aren't going to wait for that. The other thing that you want to do is just don't arbitrarily fail a build in your automated pipeline just because a component comes back vulnerable, especially on the development check-in. What we do is we provide a warning in our build tools that say, you have a vulnerable component and it exceeds the threshold of acceptable vulnerability level in the organization. We'll let you put this into a staging environment so you don't disrupt the business from doing acceptance testing or the executives for seeing that there's progress being made on this product development, but we're not going to let you deploy it to production. And I think that's an important part of automation. You really have to understand that it's not just about development and operations and security. The products we build have a consumer and a customer at the end of the line. And customers and consumers, whether that's our business analysts or our product owners or our executives, they want to see progress. And especially our graphic designers, they want to check to make sure that it's pixel perfect. And the sooner we can get the code to them, the sooner they can react and give us feedback on our products. The other thing is we want to do limits and thresholds. And that's very important. The first thing you want to do with any brownfield application or existing application is do a baseline scan. You want to find out how many criticals and high and low vulnerabilities, and you want to cap it. So instantly, you just want to make sure that as the development continues to go on, you're not introducing any more vulnerabilities. And that's really important for existing applications and helping the business understand that, just because we now know that these things are there doesn't mean we have to fix them immediately. And then you have different, time constraints around that. So critical vulnerabilities, that's a stop the press and get that thing fixed now. If it's a high vulnerability, maybe you have 90 days, medium, potentially 180, and then low, maybe 365. Your security team can look at these vulnerabilities in these components and say, well, based on the information we have, these two components together is really a high vulnerability. And so you can sort of adapt to those differences and those little specific problem areas, and then address those, potentially create another ticket, link the two, have them together. But these thresholds are important because, again, baselining it is very important, and introducing new vulnerabilities is something that's pretty much, you can put the line there and say that's unacceptable. And then by doing that, if a new vulnerability tries to get introduced, you can kick it back and move it left to the developer, and they're the perfect person to make sure that it can be remediated. If you wait too long and you're not moving product issues and vulnerabilities left towards the folks that created this code base or this feature or this check-in, you're going to get into a situation where, let's say that person leaves the organization, or they join a different group or something to that effect. You're going to bring someone else in to try to fix and remediate that issue, or even on the same team, but it's at a later date. And they're not going to know where that issue was. They're going to have to look through the code, learn it. And that's going to be disruptive, and it's going to really decrease the velocity that team or that individual can develop and ship product out to production. So you want to make sure that you have these limits. And then as you start remediating the issues, continuously lower the limit so brownfield applications have the same quality that greenfield applications can have. My other piece of advice is not to fear the CLI, or, another word for it is my IDE doesn't support plugins. And just because, some users in our organization specifically, they use Visual Studio or they'll use Eclipse, and there's plugins readily available for those tools. Myself, I love using Micro or even VI. And for those tools, having a plugin, you can develop them. There might not be something available. But with the CLI tool that's available, for example, the Nexus IQ CLI, you can send information, send product and tar files or whatever you'd like to the Lifecycle and get a result back. And it's very configurable, very usable, and you can take these scripts or build these scripts into your pipelines or into your IDEs as some kind of automation script, and you're going to get the same functionality that you have with these supported and consumer-based commercial plugins. So definitely don't fear the CLI and interacting with things on a shell-based level and scripting around them.
DJ, we're coming up on a 4-minute warning.
Oh, okay. I'm almost finished here. So the last couple of things is having that bill of materials and that manifest. Make sure that everything from an open source component perspective to the contents of your images in a container, the libraries that you're using are in one consistent and concise format in one location that follows your product through to production. If you have that manifest, what components are being used, you can do a couple of different things. First, if you have an event that's a vulnerability or something that's come out that the fire drill is on, you can identify where those components are. And there's tools that do that too. But having the manifest, it makes things very easy to isolate and identify at the production level. And the other thing that you want to do with these is just make sure that the components that you have in your container images, for example, are valid. I've said many times over the past year and a half that having a Bluetooth driver inside of a container image doesn't make any sense, or even a desktop environment. Make those images as small as you can, and you're really reducing your attack footprint. And the last thing is, adopt DevSecOps. Take the time in your organizations to understand that open source components are probably one of the biggest things that can introduce vulnerabilities. And again, that code is open source, so people everywhere know that. You want to make sure that you know what the risk is of using these components, and you want to make sure that development and securities and operations understand what these vulnerabilities actually mean. For example, let's say there's a SQL injection or some kind of command injection. These things have been around for 15 years in the OWASP top 10, and not understanding what these things do or what these things can, the impact it can have on the organization, is probably a great, not failure, but a great topic that needs to be discussed. So with that, adopt DevSecOps, take the time, break down those silos and communicate with each other, and you're going to have more successful software delivery. So with that, thank you very much. And I think we have a couple minutes for questions and a strangling PyPy logo in the bottom corner of the screen.
There you go. I had to show you my beard here because I told you we were having a competition, right? One of the things that you said, DJ, which I thought was fascinating, because there is another camp to it, is, if I heard you correctly, you said, I don't fail the build because of a bad component. I move the build through the pipeline, giving the other teams downstream the chance to do their work while we're making the fix. Did I hear that properly?
Absolutely. I think that it's very important that we do that. Hopefully I stop screen sharing here. Oh, there we go. It's not just about the development and operations and security team. It's about the whole business, right? And I think that's the culture of communication that I've seen happen here, and I really think can happen anywhere. Again, it's going to vary from business to business and organization to organization, but again, it's not about just arbitrarily failing something. And if you keep failing the builds, for example, and your executives don't get a piece of product, then all of a sudden your business analyst, you're going to get this friction. You're going to get these questions like, well, what are you doing? Is DevSecOps working? And, that's something we want to avoid. We want to avoid that kind of, negative perspective of, what we're trying to accomplish here.
Thank you so much. Always good to talk to you. We'll see you in Singapore.
Absolutely.
Yes,
it's going to be fun.
July 24th is going to be fun. And then you're going to jump over to the Slack room and answer any questions for people for the next 15 minutes, right?
Oh, I'll be on there longer than that. I love talking about this kind of stuff. And I love the beard, Mark. You're looking good, man.
Thanks. It'll be longer when I see you next.
Yeah, I might have to do the ZZ top. I don't think I can grow it that long, though. But thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye. Sarah, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. What was the picture there? It looked like somebody looking in a store window or something.
That is a picture in the Detroit airport looking at the metro rail. I was on my way to PenguinCon, which is a Linux open source science fiction convention. And I took that picture. It looked like a little boy looking in wonder at the world around him.
Yeah.
So that's what I have as my Google profile.
Very
nice. Thank you.
Okay. Your topic is dear to my heart. I started out about, what was it, 2006. I was doing AIDS vaccine research development and building a pipeline to manage it. And so when I saw what your session was doing, I said, healthcare doesn't get enough visibility for what they're doing as far as the stuff that you're working on. So very, very happy to see your session here. Where are you physically? Where do you reside?
Right now I'm in Rockville, Maryland.
All right.
Maryland, USA.
Yeah. All right. So good. I'm going to get out of your way here. I'll turn mine off.
Can you screen share a little for us, and that way I can verify you're doing good?
All right. Sharing my screen, pulling up my PowerPoint, putting it in full view. So just tell me, can you see my title slide full screen right now?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, that's great.
You might turn off the bottom, or the Google Hangouts has a little hide this button.
Thank you.
Okay, there you go. You're good to go.
All right. So this is my title slide. I'm going to be talking about how we use Nexus at National Cancer Institute, and I will I'm going to do some intros of National Cancer Institute, the environment there, myself. I want to talk about the Nexus Pro instances that we use at National Cancer Institute, how we use Nexus in our workflow, and I will include some talk about continuous integration there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the integration that we have with some of the other tools, the benefits we're seeing of using Nexus, and future plans and opportunities for using Nexus more and doing more improvements to our overall process and tooling. So National Cancer Institute, for those who don't know, that's a government agency. We are under Health and Human Services, under the National Institutes of Health. So our domains that we have that you can look at from the outside world are nci.nih.gov and cancer.gov are our main locations. So NCI manages, I'm sorry about the typo, a broad range of research, training, and information dissemination activities. So NCI helps researchers, helps train more researchers and scientists and clinicians, etc., and also provides information to the general public about, say, information about different cancers or how you might look to get routed into a clinical trial, etc. NCI is the largest funder of cancer research in the world. And I will be referring to CBIT several times during this talk. I am situated within CBIT. That's the Center for Biomedical Informatics and Information Technology. And we support all of NCI. So to explain a little bit about myself. First of all, I just want to make very clear, I am speaking as a practitioner. I am a contractor. I am not a direct employee of NCI. They like me to make that clear when I speak. So my employer is actually General Dynamics Information Technology. One of the things I wanted to mention was the description on the speaker page on SCED, for instance, says I was going to talk about how we're using it within GDIT. So my presentation actually is going to focus on our work specifically at National Cancer Institute. We just got acquired by General Dynamics Information Technology recently. I did give a presentation last week to my legacy General Dynamics Information Technology compatriots, and I am hoping to learn more about how they are doing continuous integration, build dependency management, etc. And maybe some of us will come back next year and talk about how other parts of our company do work. So I am on the Linux engineering team with CBIT infrastructure support. I've been supporting National Cancer Institute for 10 years. My title is config manager. I am an ITIL expert. I believe that ITIL and DevOps can be compatible. It depends on how you apply it. It's a framework for reference, common language, etc. So in my job here, I wear a lot of hats. I do application build and deploy automation. I do initial consultations with groups that want our infrastructure support, whether it means they need a server for a new website or they are down in the lab at National Institutes of Health and need network support, or they want to talk with us about storage options for large amounts of data, etc. I'm going on call again next week, and I also do some project management. So this talk is going to talk focus specifically on Nexus use here. If you go back to my all-day DevOps presentation from October, I talk a lot more about how our overall work fits in with the process, how we do DevOps, our agile focus, etc., which talks about the processes, the teams we work with. This talk is going to be more technical. So, but you can go back and look if you're curious about kind of the larger picture and context for what we do. So the National Cancer Institute is very heterogeneous. So for the over 700 websites that we support, remember I talked about research and training and information dissemination. So we have static HTML, we have complex bioinformatics applications. These are on multiple tiers. It's thousands of servers. Some of these are legacy applications still hanging on. Some are thriving and under continual development. Some are brand new projects that we're piloting or working with. Our application layer and containers that we deal with may be HTML, Drupal, Tomcat, JBoss, Wildfly, Docker. We have some legacy stuff, and we have a few other things, but that's the majority of what we work with. Our servers are mostly, we have a lot of Linux servers and a lot of Windows servers. Most of our infrastructure is virtual machines. We do have some physical machines for situations where they absolutely need physical support for what they're doing. We have an on-premise data center. We are starting to do more and more with AWS. And the developers that we work with range from lone scientists to large teams with varying programming experience. So some of them need more infrastructure team support, some need less. So all this is just to say our whole process for dealing with build and deploy has to be flexible. So I'm going to talk about the, so we're using Nexus Pro repository manager at National Cancer Institute. And I'm going to talk some about the specific instances that we have at National Cancer Institute. We started with a 2x instance. I'll be talking about the 3x instances on the next slide, but that's the 2x is what we started with, the professional repository manager. That is using the Maven format. So we have mostly binaries and some text files and so on there. On that instance, we are proxying the approved repository. So we have a process for checking about adding instances to be proxied as opposed to just willy-nilly adding every instance that could possibly be proxied. So that there's a process where we go through and evaluate that because we care about build resiliency for things that we may need to support years later. So we also host a lot of locally built and customized binaries. We had been using Ant-Ivy before and moved a lot of files from Ivy, from our Subversion repository at the time that Ivy and Ant drew on. So some of those we put in at the beginning, and then as more development happens, we've added more customized binaries. In some cases, due to our National Cancer Institute security profile and other reasons, we have some customized binaries of open source jars and so on. So in some cases, we've run scripts to upload a bunch of things bulk. We've also done one-off manual uploads. And I'm happy that the uploading ability has kind of been added back in Nexus 3X. So anyway, I'll move on. So we also, some of our applications that we build, for some of them, we publish those binaries to Nexus. So we have it set up for some projects. We work with projects to make sure they understand how to set things up in their XML files so that they can enable automatic publications from builds. That is not the majority of our applications, but we do have that for some. Also, this 2x instance is where we migrated the repositories from Mayo Clinic, which had their own instance of Nexus Repository Manager. We work with Mayo Clinic on some of our applications, and they decided to shut their repository manager down, but we were able to take on all of their binaries to ensure that what we were building is still available to be built. And all right. So for 3X, we are doing some work with 3X and expect to be doing more as we go along. We have a 3X Docker instance that is used for some projects. We are expecting use of that instance to increase a lot more because we are doing more with Docker. We also have a 3X raw images instance. And then we also did a sort of a prototype with the Git LFS format. So I mentioned SVN before. We did an SVN to Git migration on GitHub. There were a number of large files that had been being stored in Subversion, which we didn't migrate them. We ended up not migrating them to Git. We archived them because they were mainly for some inactive projects. However, this kind of alerted us that we ought to be ready in case we needed to be able to support large format, large files. So we set up a Nexus instance strictly for Git LFS storage, and the way that works is with, the Git file has a pointer to the file in Nexus. So we're ready for that if applications demonstrate a need for that. So right now, these are all separate instances, and I'll talk on my future slide about what we may be doing going forward for consolidation. So integration into the workflow, most of our applications use Maven or Apache Ant. That is changing. We're starting to use some more technologies, but for Maven and for Ant build scripts, we provide XML templates and a settings XML file, which points to our Nexus 2X instance for dependencies. And so that is trying to ensure that our applications will be built pointing to our Nexus instance, which we know will be up, etc. We know how it's backed up. We know what it has cached, etc. We do have a little bit of NPM, and we're working with some other newer technologies as well, and we'll be figuring out what we can do to capitalize and leverage for that. So this is just an example of one of the build XML files. You see it's on GitHub. You can actually go and look at our URI resolver project and look at the POM XML. The settings XML is not in public view, but you can look at how that has things set up for referring to the builds. Let's see. So for continuous integration, so most of our active projects are on or migrating to Jenkins. We're using open source Jenkins. We don't have a lot of direct tie to Jenkins, but of course our builds use Jenkins. I'm sorry, we don't have a lot of direct ties between Jenkins and Nexus, although we will be looking more at that. But obviously our build scripts that are run on Jenkins refer to our Nexus repository manager instance. We do also have some legacy tooling. We're migrating everything off of Anthill Pro since it's been end of lifed by IBM. We've done some experiments with Travis CI and expect to, try other tools. But for right now, it's Jenkins is where we're putting the bulk of our automation. So for packaging, I mentioned all the many containers and so on that we have. So our build artifacts might be zips, wars, ears, or Docker images. So the release packages currently are primarily stored on Jenkins. That may change. We do have some applications that publish directly to Nexus. Some of them are using the Maven release plugin to do that. Some of our applications have other NCI applications depending on them, and we've found it easier to have them in Nexus to be pulled for those applications. And then, as I mentioned, we're also doing some image storing of Nexus Docker, and I'm going to be talking more about that when I talk about some of our security stuff. So for our deploys, our standard tiers include dev, QA, stage, and production. That's not the only tiers we have. As I mentioned, some projects have special tiers, for instance, for data curation versus feature testing. And so we promote up the tiers to production. Here is a picture of our 2x instance. This shows our structure where we have right now the picture has the third-party files that are locally hosted highlighted, but above that you can see that we do have groups for QA releases, stage releases, dev releases, etc. CBID hosted, again, I mentioned the organization we primarily support is CBID under National Cancer Institute. So this is just to give you an idea of some of our use. All right, so integration with other tools. So we are using Twistlock for Docker image scanning, and that is very tightly related to our Nexus 3x Docker image repository. Again, in my all-day DevOps presentation, I talked more about how connected we are with the other parts of the organization, the security team, et cetera, the developers and all that. So security is very much on our mind. For Docker, what we have set up is we're using a commercial tool called Twistlock. So it's used actually in 3 different places related to our Docker images. One is we're using Jenkins to build the Docker images. To do that, we refer to Twistlock to do a scan of the image before we actually publish that to the Nexus 3x Docker image repository. So that's during the build. And then once it's in that repository, well, security vulnerabilities, new ones are discovered every day. So we keep scanning the Nexus Docker image repository because we know that new vulnerabilities might show up in files that are already in that repository. And then just before we would deploy to any new tier, we'd perform another scan just to make sure nothing has popped up since the last time we did our regular scans of the image repository. So we have found a number of benefits of using Nexus. I didn't go into our whole evaluation process where we decided to choose Nexus over some of the other options, but what we wanted to do was simplify the maintenance of the internal artifact repositories the access to the external artifact repositories. So you saw that the GitHub files are in, you saw our source code for many of our projects is in GitHub, and Nexus instance, the 2x instance, is currently public facing to allow for community engagement of, say, universities that want to download National Cancer Institute code and try and build it. So our artifact repositories that some of those builds refer to are public, and it was simpler to do that with Nexus. We also are hosting other types of artifacts, not just those generated by Maven. We are doing some looking into more use of the raw images, and I was interested to hear the discussion earlier today about the blob capability for cloud storage. Anyway, benefits. So we're able to do the proxies for requests for external artifacts and cache the results. So once we've built something, we have build resilience to be able to build it again. That's not perfect, but as with security, perfect build reproducibility, there are trade-offs. You have to decide what level you're trying to ensure. So also benefits, it provides a deployment destination for NCI-generated artifacts, release packages, and so on. All right. So for the future, we are planning to migrate our 2x instance to a 3x instance later on this year. We have been trying to do that. It got pushed back a little from when we thought we'd do it, but I think we are going to be able to start tackling it pretty aggressively this month and next month. We are planning. We know there will be more use of Docker among NCI application projects. We need to improve our Docker instance management, and we also expect to see more orchestration, automation, and how much we start leveraging Nexus even more than that, we are going to be looking into. I know that we have openings to leverage it more. We're also going to look at consolidating the artifact locations even more than we have them right now. You saw that we have multiple Nexus instances. We know we're not going to combine the main Maven 2 instance with the Docker image repository, even though they'll both be 3x instances later this year, just for performance reasons. So we have to look at the trade-offs for the consolidation of, we want things simple, but we also want to ensure that we have the right balance for performance, et cetera. So integration with workflow tools. One of the previous speakers was talking about Jira use. We are not sure to what extent we're going to do that, but we have a fair bit of use of Jira and ServiceNow, depending on which team you're working with. Also, so I've been mainly talking about application build and deployment, automation, et cetera. We are using Puppet. We are doing some Ansible. And we may be able to work on instances, on further leveraging of Nexus with that. We're also hoping to do more security improvements. I would love for us to be doing scanning of dependency artifacts before building, and more integration and automation related to security profiles. There we go. Somehow I skipped past. Okay, I skipped past my line where I was talking about that we are doing more NPM. We've had Yum for quite a while. Right now, we have Yum, our Yum repository stored another way. We may look at using Nexus for Yum management in the future, and NPM as well. We don't have heavy use of it at NCI, but we might be able to leverage Nexus for that as well. Let's see, I want to thank some of my teammates, Phil Hartman and Srini Gadila and Robert Zhang, that I talked with to make sure I was all the most current. The Nexus stuff I've done is most with the 2x, but I did want to be able to talk about the 3x that we are doing more and more of. So I will be going on to the Slack channel, and You can also look for me on Twitter at configures, or search my name. And I'm going to minimize this and just make sure that y'all are still hearing me. Can someone say something?
You're
okay.
doing great.
Okay, so
I'll
share the thing again. But Mark, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a question for you. Curious, and I really don't know the answer here. When you did the migration of Nexus from different sources, like I think you said you had integration with the Mayo Clinic that you brought it in, imported in. How was that process?
Well, we did end up talking a fair bit with Sonatype support to try and make that go the best we could. Let me just think a minute. I could definitely follow up in the Slack channel in a few minutes on that, but I just want to remember for sure we tried a few different ways. We ended up getting large files from them and unrolling them on the new on our Nexus instance, and then we had to go in and set up pointers and permissions. So it was kind of a brute force approach. We had been for years just proxying their repository, but when they were going to shut it down, we had to kind of react in a hurry. So we ended up taking a pretty brute force approach of taking the files. They made very large tar files, and then we got them and unrolled them in the location that we had discussed with the Sonatype support people, and set up the connection points, set them up in the repositories and groups again, so that they could be accessed as though they had been there all along, and so that our builds could still. We had to do some tweaking with we didn't actually have to change the builds, but we had to change some of the access and group configurations, as I recall. But I'd be happy to talk about that more in detail. That's about all I can say offhand. It was a while ago.
Well, thank you. We look forward to seeing you in the Slack channel. For those of you that have questions for Sarah, she is headed for the Slack channel. And,
okay.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure. Jim Bird, how are you? We're looking. There you go.
I'm doing good, Mark. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Thank you. Long time no talk.
That's right. Yeah, it's been a while.
For those of you that don't know BIDSTrading, why don't you give them kind of a quick overview? What is BIDS about?
We're an institutional trading platform in the United States and in Europe. We provide a safe and secure platform for institutional traders to trade large blocks of stock.
Cool.
And
all right.
Related marketplace in both U.S. and in Europe.
Great. Then I'm interested in hearing about what you're doing, definitely, because what you're talking about, I mean, I follow Michael Lewis, so all I know about this stuff is Flash Boys and all the stuff that he's been.
Well, we won't be talking about that stuff, that's for sure.
All right, I'll turn it over to you, Jim. Go ahead and share your slide deck.
Okay. Screen share. Just give me a moment, Mark. It takes a little moment to come up.
There, I see the screen share. You go into full mode from the beginning. There you go. And I'll get into the background, and you're ready to go.
Well, let's make sure the show starts first, and in case you have to help me do something in the meantime. Right. Okay, what do you see now?
I see your presenter view. I see your notes view, not
okay.
Not the full thing from the beginning.
And I want to swap that. Now you see.
Excellent, beautiful.
All right.
And then down at the very bottom, I see the Google Hangouts. Just hide that. There you go.
Oh,
all right, I'm here behind you if you need it.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, great. All right, we're going to talk today about 5 quick wins for securing continuous delivery. First of all, a little background on me, why you should listen to me. I've had over 20 years, actually quite a lot more than 20 years now, of experience in the IT industry. Most of my experience is more on the software side and operations side. I work in the security. I'm responsible for security for our firm, but I've come to it from an operations and like an IT operations and security angle and background. I've worked with stock exchanges and banks all around the world for quite a long time. I'm the CTO of our firm, and I've still implementing DevOps practices. So we've been following DevOps practices for several years now in a highly regulated environment. I also help out at the SANS Institute. I'm an analyst there and a co-author of their secure DevOps courses, and I help out with different OWASP projects. And if you have developers who care about secure software, please have them check out the Proactive Controls. That's a project that I'm a co-manager, co-project leader on, or whatever, and I feel very strongly about it. I think it's a great project, so to put a plug in for that. And I've also written a bunch of blogs and articles and written books or co-written books on agile application security and DevOps security. A couple of disclaimers: not representing my employer in official capacity necessarily. I'm not selling you anything. And I'm going to talk about some techniques that I've seen work, both in my firm and in many others, but your mileage may vary. So first of all, as some quick background, let's kind of my perspective on DevOps. Kind of think of it coming from a development background. It's agile on steroids, right? So you had a case where agile teams, we've been working in agile environments for quite some time. Agile teams would just simply run into that wall in operations, wouldn't be able to get things done fast enough. So you had this disconnect and this frustration and cost and other issues. And essentially what I see is DevOps is applying agile practices and values to that last mile into production and into the ongoing life of the system. And we're changing from people thinking of delivering products or projects to essentially running systems, right? Or running services, right? So that service-based idea where now developers are responsible for owning those services end to end and keeping them running. And the other important thing here is about the continuous feedback loop. So that's one of the things that takes teams a while to understand and appreciate, including security teams, is this idea of creating feedback loops, not necessarily knowing that realizing that you can't get everything perfect the first time, and using feedback loops to optimize and improve and learn. And all of this requires extensive automation, which leads to incredible hype from amazing vendors. Some are more amazing than others, but there's some good vendors in this space, and there's a bunch of other people who just make a lot of noise. So yeah, one of the big issues here from a security and compliance standpoint, so being in a very highly regulated space, you take a look at this and say, DevOps teams are moving so fast, how do you deal with it? How do you identify and contain the risks when self-managing teams are making decisions on their own? If you're using change advisory boards, how do you deal with that? Like, how do they possibly keep up with changes that are deployed several times a day sometimes, or at least several times a week? Your annual pen tests and periodic vulnerability assessments, if you're doing quarterly or monthly vulnerability assessments, they're quickly made irrelevant and out of date. And then how can you prove compliance when you've got developers owning systems, pushing things out on their own, and running them in production? And one of the other real challenges that I've seen a lot of organizations face is this whole idea that lean development and delivery, the whole focus on speed and cost and efficiency, is ensuring that anything that isn't efficient gets cut, and that includes security. If it's not efficient, if it gets in the team's way, it's going to get cut out. So even though there's all these perceived risks or potential risks with moving so fast, with continuous delivery and continuous deployment of changes, you also get some built-in risk management that's important to understand and to take advantage of. So one of them is that because people are breaking work down in small pieces, that's going to reduce delivery costs and risks. And we've already proved that with agile development. Now continuous delivery just allows us to take greater advantage of that, right? Reduce the operational risk, project risk, delivery risk, that kind of thing. Continuous delivery Also ensures that we can get everything done through that last mile into production. So, automating those pipelines and getting the pain out of it, making change become routine is helping take the risk out of making changes. So you don't have these big bang changes. And again, it's one of the big positive messages that we have. And that change becomes cheap. And because change becomes cheap and routine and safe, it means that people can afford to make smaller changes. They can break things down. So you get this virtuous circle, right? Because you've got people making smaller changes, deploying them more often. And because they can deploy them more often, they can make even smaller changes. So they can afford to make very small bets, and they can iterate through these things. And rather than trying to anticipate things and building in too much code and creating a larger attack surface or more problems, more potential operational problems and risks. And one of the big advantages from a security perspective is that because you can push out changes fast, that means you can also push out fixes fast, right? So you can push out patches and vulnerabilities very quickly and efficiently, which takes away some of the argument about, what are we going to do? How are we going to get these things fixed, right? So I want to talk about 5 steps that you can take, or 5 quick wins in the space of how to secure continuous delivery and continuous automated build pipelines and these kinds of things. And if you want to think about how can you make DevOps secure, you got to do security in the same way that the DevOps teams are working. So you want to become iterative and incremental. You want to work that way. So rather than trying to solve all the problems or solve all the problems perfectly up front, you want to say, okay, let me start to solve a problem. Attack real risks and threats, problems that everybody agrees are a big deal, including compliance and developers and managers, everybody, so you can get people on side and say, yeah, this is a real problem. Let's try to solve it. Let's try to solve it as quickly as possible. We won't necessarily get it all solved in one shot, but we'll try to reduce the risk in a meaningful way. And we'll do this in ways that are very efficient, with minimal friction, minimal delays, and that are easy and cheap to implement. And that's what we're going to talk about here, is how to do this in an easy and cheap way. So one of the first wins that I'd like to talk about is adding automated safety checks to your pipelines. Now, why would you want to do this? Again, we're making a lot of changes to the system. We're making changes more frequently. This is one of the ideas behind a lot of these DevOps practices and continuous delivery and continuous deployment, is you want to make a lot of small changes, make them often. But that also means that you can make mistakes, right? So if you're not careful, you can make a basic mistake, introduce some kind of regression, or introduce some kind of unsafe default. And it's pretty easy to do this kind of thing. And because it's easy to deploy it and efficient to deploy it, these mistakes will make it out into production very quickly. So the idea is that you want to have simple, fast checks that can find bad mistakes before the bad guys do, before the attackers can pick them up through scanners or something. And I like Netflix's model here about the idea of putting in guardrails, right? So this is part of your guardrails for your development team. You want to keep them on the safe path, help them catch errors, which are natural. People are going to make mistakes. And you do this by running continuous smoke tests in your test environment. Containers like Docker and cloud platforms make this really easy to do, efficient to do. And by putting in a framework, you can quickly add more checks when new threats come up. And you're going to make your auditors happy, because they can see that policies are actually being enforced. You actually see that security checks are being done and made. And you start to familiarize developers with security tools and testing. So all the kinds of basic stuff you want to add into your pipeline. You have default missing credentials, SSL, HTTPS settings, and whatnot, checking for ports that shouldn't be open, and making sure file and user permissions are set correctly. These kinds of things tend to regress fairly easily. There's some good frameworks out there. You can use, take a look at Netflix Security Monkey or Conformity Monkey as reference patterns. There's Gauntlet. It's probably the most famous of these test frameworks, right? It's a test wrapper over other tools. OWASP Zap has a nice baseline scan that you can plug into your pipeline. It runs for, I think, 2 minutes or something, 1.5 minutes, something like that. And the idea there is it does a unauthenticated scan of the quick unauthenticated scan of the surface of a web app. If it finds something within that very, very fast scan, then you know you're in trouble, because some other automated scanner on the internet is going to do the same thing. Some other excellent tools out there, OS Query, that Facebook open sourced, that you can use SQL to check your configuration, write all kinds of queries, and you can integrate OS Query into some fleet management systems and be able to run queries across your entire infrastructure and just check to make sure that things are looking good. I also really like InSpec. It's an open source compliance testing framework that's the nice people from Chef have made available open source. And you can use that to assert configuration policies in language that your compliance auditors will understand. It's a beautiful thing. And of course, there's built-in cloud services too, so do this kind of thing. So the second quick win is lightweight risk assessments. And what you want to be able to do here is people are making decisions, teams are making decisions very quickly, and we want them to be able to make these decisions even faster, right? So we have to make sure that we are always on the lookout for risks. So what you want to be able to do is have some kind of upfront risk assessment that's made before a project starts, before a service gets, development on a service gets started. And any time that the team makes a major change in direction, so if major new requirements come in, or if they're throwing out technology and deciding to, introduce some new technology because they've decided, that whatever they're doing doesn't scale or they're not happy with it, you want to be able to do a quick risk assessment. You also need to understand all the data, or the main parts of data that the service or app handles, and then if there's any privacy or compliance requirements. And so that you can get these security and compliance stories onto their backlog and make sure that that security now becomes visible to the team, visible to the managers, visible to people outside the team. So we can say, okay, great, they have some certain problems that they want to be able to take care of. And I also, again, going back to another Netflix analogy of a paved road, you want to find out whether or not the team is using technology that's already proven, that you already understand, that you already have good controls in place for, essentially saying that road has been paved over. You know that you can have the proper tests and scans in their pipeline, and if not, you can add things in pretty quickly. So there's a nice model out there called, actually the one I like, one of the ones I like the best is Mozilla's Rapid Risk Assessment. You can just do some Googling, you'll find that. And the whole idea here is it's a 30-minute review, very quick review upfront, lightweight review, follow standard checklist, identify the key risks, identify any of the build or continuous delivery toolchain requirements for testing, scanning, that kind of thing. And again, if you don't already have something, you got to put something in place. And one of the nice things is you can use that to feed into an organization or project-wide risk heat map. That's one of the practices they follow at Mozilla and organizations like PayPal. And it's a nice model because now you know this project's a medium risk, low risk. It's a red, there's a whole bunch of stuff, potential risks there, and you can start to monitor it from a governance standpoint. And do all this with very little time and very little cost and friction. A third quick win is all about writing security tests, security unit tests. And this is something that I think a lot of developers struggle with, and they struggle with getting introduced into their practice. But one of the best ways to start is to, as you find vulnerabilities, take a test-driven development approach, which is to write the test first, to duplicate, to make sure that you know that the vulnerability exists, you can prove that it exists. And then have them fix the vulnerability and run the test and make sure that afterwards that the test passed, right? So the kind of the whole red-green model. What's nice about this is a few different things, right? Once you start introducing this approach into things, you start off slow and small. So you're saying we find a new vulnerability in pen testing or something, and we agree it's an important thing to fix. We've now got a test in place, So that test shows them how to test for these kinds of problems. It provides evidence to auditors that you've actually fixed something. And you start getting developers to get off the happy path, right? So most production developer unit tests and acceptance tests all prove that the code works, not that the code that doesn't check for things where the code might not work. And so what you want to be able to do is get them to write not just happy tests, the developer tests, but you want to do sad tests and bad tests. And I love this example here, a little discussion, about the different kinds of testing, right? With a QA engineer walking into a bar and the different kinds of things that a QA engineer would do versus what a pen tester would do, right? So all the different kinds of, so going from boundary testing to going into actual injection attacks and those kinds of things, introducing developers into this whole way of thinking is going to make a huge impact on your development in development over time, because even though you're taking small steps, at first you're only introducing a handful of tests, but over time that test suite gets bigger, and over time people start thinking different. They start writing better tests as part of their normal development, which protects more new code going in. So you're not just talking about the modest steps that you're taking to start off. Your quick win number 4, securing the software supply chain. And you would have heard about this a lot, and you will already be aware of it quite well if you're a Sonatype customer. So we already know that vulnerabilities in third-party code expose your systems to serious risks. And we all want to be prepared for the next heartbleed. So one of the things to do here is to start by understanding what outside code your engineers are using and those security vulnerabilities and technical debt that you have. So any code that you're using that's been abandoned and is no longer supported, now to date, and of course license risks and those kinds of things. One of the things I like about introducing this into a pipeline and into the workflows is that it's actually relatively easy to do. It takes there's some lifting to do up front, but once you do it, you've got a nice control system going forward, right? And I know that I've listened to some of the other presentations already about how far some of these organizations have taken this, and it's really impressive, right? So again, you create the baseline bill of materials, then you can monitor things going forward, catch exceptions, and start to create your own internal safe repos to reduce your risk to outside code. What's nice about this is that the heavy work is done up front, and it's all about understanding your build environment, your build and packaging, and that's something that you've got to do anyway. So it's something that it's important for teams from an operational risk standpoint and development risk standpoint, as well as security and governance risk, right? You want to understand how you build and package things, what your dependencies are, right? And then you take a look and put in tools that will help you do this, right? And there's a number of tools. One of the things to keep in mind here is that some of the tools don't identify transitive dependencies, right? So if you might have some relatively simple tools that just do a superficial scan and a superficial dependency map. Those ones won't give you the full advantage, right? You still got you still have some other risk sitting out there in your dependency chain. And so you can take advantage of some relatively straightforward tools. Some of them are open source here. Some of the ones, some of the more popular ones, right? OWASP dependency check, retire.js. Of course, there's Nexus Lifecycle and Nexus Lifecycle Firewall. Those are there's commercial tools, obviously, but they provide a lot more control and a lot more capability and reduce your risk to a greater extent. And then there's other nice things, right? I mean, GitHub's actually started to put in security alerts for some of their dependencies and this kind of thing, right? For some project dependencies. So we're starting to see this problem being dealt with in more ways with more tools, because it's a serious problem and it's a good problem to solve. So it's one of the first ones that you want to take advantage of. And the last thing that I put in here was around self-service code scanning. So what I'm talking about here is taking advantage of software scanning tools. looking for bugs and bad practices in code, and taking that out of the security and compliance team, getting that into the development team, and making it part of their responsibility. This to me is one of the more powerful of the scanning kind of capabilities. It's very complementary to the dependency scanning. So now what you're doing is you're saying, all right, dependency scanning is telling you about any kind of components that have known problems. This kind of scanning, static analysis scanning, is going to go out there and try to find other problems in your existing code base. And what's nice about this is it fits into your workflows and into the tools. There's getting to be more and more tools that work nicely inside the IDE. You've got pre-commit hooks now if you're using Git workflows, and you can add scanners into pipelines so that you can do all this and make it part of the development team's responsibility. These are problems that they find, problems that they can fix right away, and that don't basically creep into the code base. So if you can make this a nice tight loop, you'll see problems getting fixed very, very quickly. And the other thing is that if you are doing code reviews, or where you do code reviews, the use of these scanning tools will improve, basically backstop and make the process more effective and efficient, because code reviewers don't have to step into and look at all kinds of details. So there's all kinds of good tools out there. If you're in the Java space, now there's essentially a little ecosystem of tools if you're in open source, where you take spot bugs and the find security bugs plugin and the FP contrib plugin, stick them all together, and you've got a very nice little ecosystem that does very good checking for you. .NET, there's some wonderful new stuff built on Roslyn. So there's some great tools out there now that weren't available even a couple years ago. There's all sorts of other nice ones out there. Like I said, the Git space has got some very interesting additional checks that you can do to check for things like secrets and other stuff that's another common problems in your code base. And the key here is that you want to make this efficient, tools that find problems, high fidelity problems very quickly, and that you can still run your other deeper scans, more complete scans, compliance scans or something further out. But in most cases, what's happening is people are making small changes. The mistakes will be small mistakes. They'll be pretty obvious to find. So what will happen is that if you're running fast scanning on a continuous basis and then deep scanning on kind of like an intermediate or periodic basis, you'll be able to catch a lot of the problems in a very effective way. So obviously this is, you're on a journey, we haven't actually reached the end here. We've only started with all these quick wins. In my experience, deep, real change to culture and workflow and work and development practice takes a long time. It takes years to get people to really change and to understand things. And but the quick wins will get you started. These are things that you can work on. They create touch points between development teams and security teams. If you have if you need to create relationships, show progress, you can build on the incremental success, and it gives you opportunities here to find, to get developer buy-in, management buy-in. It's a good thing. So I'd recommend going back and looking at an approach to taking an incremental approach, solve real risks, do it quick and easy as you can, and don't try to force new workflows or practices on the team. Try to adapt to how they work. I've listed a whole bunch of resources that I found really handy, that I think are very helpful to people. So that's for later. You can look at that when you get the presentation and download the slides or whatever. And oh yeah, I wanted to point out one. There's one at the very bottom. It's an old book that's now been released, a relatively old book, if you want to think of it, a classic in the web operations space called Release It. And there's a second edition that's just recently come out, end of last year. It was early this year. Anyways, it's been updated for DevOps and continuous delivery and that kind of thing, and it's a must-have. If you have the old one, you should get the new one. If you don't have the old one, you should get the new one. So, fantastic book by Michael Nygaard. It's definitely a need. So, thank you for listening, and thank you, Mark and Derek and everybody else for setting this up.
Sure. Jim, when I'm looking at this, one of the things that I would be interested in is, as you look at the 5 points that you put there. Is there one cherry pick that you would start with from the patterns that you've seen?
To me, I guess it depends on where your risks are and how much a new development or something that you're making, right? So if you're yeah, that's a very valid point. To me, I think like I said, it depends on what your risks are, how fast you're trying to move. I mean, like if you have a big code base out there already, a natural one would be the dependency management stuff, right? So it's I'm not just throwing that at you, Mark, because of Sonatype, but it's a valid one. Like if you've got a big existing code base and you want to try to get security in faster, that's a good place to start. If you're moving really quickly and you're iterating a lot and throwing a lot of stuff out, I would suggest some kind of the safety checks, right? Because so we've done different things in different teams and different projects because of different risks, right? But if you have somebody that's we're changing a lot of things, changing direction a lot, putting in some safety checks there will at least catch mistakes, right? And catch the changes in direction. So those would be two that I think, because other ones take a little longer to fit in. If you think about static analysis, it takes a little longer to get buy-in, a little longer to implement properly in tune, but the other ones are faster, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the questions are already lining up in the chat room, so we'll kind of close you off here. So if you would run to the Slack channel and then upload your slide deck there, and you've got a question already waiting for you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, very much.
Jim.
Derek, you want to close out this session?
Yeah, we've already got the next channel up and running live. We are going to take a 15-minute break here, but if you're following us on Sketch, then you have the URL for that session up there. So just see a holding pattern slide that we have there. At the moment, Daniel Sauble and Shade Salone are going to be with us from the user experience team at Sonatype. So they're going to talk a little bit about the Nexus Lifecycle product, the work that they've done there, the feedback that they've gotten from the community to improve that product user experience. So it's going to be a really exciting kickoff session for our next one up there. So join us there. And as always, find Jim Bird, who just presented, Mark Miller, myself, and everyone else on the Slack channels. We'll see you in 15 minutes. Thanks.
All right. I'm going to put up a little note here for everybody to send them over to the next channel, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.